This is, interestingly enough, take two, because Creighton sabotaged my attempt to explain what we're doing. And so, Creighton, explain to the audience what we're doing.
Okay, so what we're doing is we are doing a video recording, or just a videoing or a recording.
I made the mistake of saying we were videotaping, and Creighton said there's no such thing. No one understands
No one
that.
knows what videotape is. I don't know. I think that Tarantino might have done a movie on tape recently, but he's like one of two people who have recorded anything on a tape in the last 10 years.
So we're video recording.
We're recording a video of our recording of the Outlaw Radio, which sounds great. It's a very concise way of putting it.
It's a very concise way. We do 4 blocks of audio that then get sent to our producer, who formats it for radio. Once he's done working his magic, Josh Brown, it gets sent back to us, and we podcast it. This stuff happens pretty quick, but we are videoing the recording, which we think is creative and fun. I see you're rocking his production.
You gotta shout out the man that feeds you. You know,
A little the man that feeds you. A little bit of product placement
yes.
there. A lot of things are happening in the world. Most notably, we are, week 3, week 4, give or take, into coronavirus, COVID-19. The last several episodes of the Outlaw Radio Show, we've started the episode by kind of giving a where are we now bit of a segment, and then kind of using that as a lead-in to various angles to discuss this pandemic and how we're supposed to be approaching this as Christians, as believers, as Christ followers. Today, I don't really want to do that. Yes, we have to kind of deal with COVID-19, coronavirus. This is very relevant. It's dominating all of our lives. Where we are now, it's kind of in a wait-and-see mode. How bad is it going to get? It's bad. Most people are in some type of shelter-in-place mandate. At least we're all practicing, to a large extent, social distancing. I went to get some supplies the other day. Went up to put my stuff on the counter. The lady stepped back, and then I was standing there, and she was like, "Yeah, you have, in order for me to ring you up, you've got to go back behind that line." And I thought, wow, we are in a new world where Walmart is starting to put up the plexiglass separators, dividers that you typically have in gas stations in, let's just say, seedier parts of town.
Yeah, the nice. You got to slip it under the glass to get to the person.
Exactly, and now we're disinfecting everything. Where we are is no one really knows. You look at all the different models, and no one can say for sure what the next 2 weeks look like, other than everyone agrees it's going to be bad. Just how bad is it going to be? Who knows? And so for us at this point to try to take time to speculate, to hypothesize, to postulate theories on what we think the next week or 2 might look like, honestly, I don't have an appetite for that at the moment. I don't think you do as the audience. So I'm going to take a totally different approach with today's radio show, and that is to try to deal with affliction, to try to deal with suffering, to try to deal with really just kind of putting on the pastor's hat, biblically addressing these things. And as I was praying through what to share, I kept coming back to a Bible study that I did in Acts chapter 16 many years ago. And it was a Bible study about the Apostle Paul making his way to Philippi, getting arrested, being put into jail, there being an earthquake. It's a cool story. It's an interesting story, and I think it has a lot of a relevant application for what we're going through, because we all, to a degree, are being afflicted. If it's not economically, we're being afflicted in the sense that our lives have been totally flipped upside down, and we're dealing with an entirely new paradigm that no one was prepared for in any way, shape, or form. And so today's episode is going to be a bit of Bible teaching. We'll do the same format, 4 different blocks. Between blocks, Creighton and I will discuss what might be relevant. You game for that? You might want to make some notes.
Oh, absolutely. I will absolutely make notes.
Make a few notes, and Creighton's kind of acting as the audience. And so as things pop up in your own mind between blocks, we'll address those things and have a conversation about it. With all that being said, let's start. The music is now rolling, and we're going to dive into the radio show. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Outlaw Radio Show. My name is Zach Adams, and I pastor a church located just outside of Athens, Georgia. The name of the church is Calvary 316. Check us out digitally. We're not meeting in person because of the present pandemic, but we are live streaming our services, facebook.com/Calvary316, Sunday mornings at 10:30. So if you're local, looking for a church, or you're not, and you're hearing this on the radio or through the podcast, check us out. Hang out with us on Sunday morning. Again, 10:30 is when our live stream begins. Regardless, whether you're listening on the radio, you're listening via the podcast, or you're actually watching the video recording of these things, stay with me over the next hour as we seek to deconstruct the way that the world views us as Christians by boldly discussing relevant topics in an honest and genuine way. There's no doubt that the coronavirus is still at the forefront of everyone's mind. The last few weeks have been terrible. Wherever you're listening, however you're listening, it has afflicted you to some degree. Hopefully, it hasn't afflicted you physically. In all likelihood, it has, or someone that you know, someone that you love. This thing is highly contagious and is spreading rapidly. Regardless, we've all been affected in regards to the economy, our jobs, our way of living, our kids, our social environment. And so today I'm going to do something different. I don't think anyone has an appetite for more stats and figures and trying to theorize where we are, where we're going. There'll be a time for that, maybe next week or the week after. But today I want to put on the pastor's hat, and I want to try to provide an exhortation about affliction, about suffering, by taking us to Acts chapter 16. To begin with, I want to tell you about a story that I ran across recently about a man named Chad Arnold. Chad was a happily married 38-year-old man with 2 young kids. When in 2010, doctors informed him that he was going to need a liver transplant, and it was so dire he wouldn't see his 39th birthday if he didn't have the procedure. And immediately, his younger brother, Ryan, volunteered to donate 60% of his liver in what was really a fairly routine procedure. As this was all taking place, the family kept a blog, and I want to read for you just a few entries of how kind of the post-op events unfolded. Friday, July 30th, 11:59 a.m. Ryan is doing well this morning, groggy from the medicine, but fairly comfortable. It's taken a while for it all to sink in. Chad is functioning with Ryan's liver. Almost doesn't seem real. July 30th, same day, Friday, 11:45 p.m. It's about 12 hours later. Ryan was just moved out of the ICU and into the transplant floor. So he's now just a few rooms down from Chad. Chad went on 2 walks today, up and down the hall twice. Ryan has been pretty groggy today, but they say this is normal. Saturday, July 31st, 3:44 p.m. Today is day 3. We have been told from the beginning that this is perhaps the most difficult day, especially for the donor. Again, Chad received 60% of Ryan's liver. Things are improving this afternoon, but last night Ryan did not sleep well and has been in quite a bit of pain. Sunday, August 1st, the next day, in the morning, 10:18 a.m., unfortunately, things took a turn for the worse last night. Ryan went code blue, but was resuscitated. He's now in critical condition. We ask that you stand in faith and fight with us. Death can't have him. Monday, August 2nd, 11:04 p.m. So the next night, the post read, Ryan went to be with Jesus this afternoon. Just 4 quick days after a routine surgery to save his big brother's life, Ryan Arnold, the model of perfect health before the surgery, died of complications, leaving behind, devastatingly, a wife, 3 young kids. As one can imagine, the entire family was completely devastated by the development. When you look at Scripture and you specifically examine human suffering and what the Bible has to say about it, the Bible presents this topic with really 3 core drivers. So there's 3 core drivers when it comes to human suffering. First, Suffering manifests as a result of God's judgment on all sin. And a great example of this would be Adam and Eve's expulsion from the garden. Immediate suffering, but brought on by their consequence of sin. Secondly, suffering, according to Scripture, will manifest as a punishment for an individual sin. Another prime example would be King David and his adultery with Bathsheba, suffering in David's life because of his individual sin. So judgment on all sin, individual punishment concerning a person's sin. And thirdly, another driver would be that suffering manifests largely independent of our involvement. And a great example of this would be the anguish of a man named Job, a whole book of the Bible documenting his story. Now, the first two drivers manifest largely because of cause and effect, making their plight understandable, at least on an intellectual level. God's judgment on all sin, punishment for individual sin, we get it. But it's this third driver of human affliction that we're so often left to grapple with and struggle through because it appears to be random and often unfair. In our present situation, coronavirus. In the example I used earlier, why would God allow Ryan to die and Chad to live? It doesn't make any sense. Such was the case for a man by the name of Paul and his sidekick Silas in the ancient town of Philippi. If you're unaware of the story, while in the ancient city of Troas, unsure where God was exactly leading them next, the Apostle Paul received this incredible vision of a man from Macedonia pleading with him for help. Rocked by what he saw, Paul and his party immediately catch a boat and they set sail to Macedonia, Greece, specifically landing in the city of Philippi. Sadly, Luke, he records in Acts chapter 16, verses 20 through 24, that for really the high crimes of faithfulness to God, these men, when they arrived in Philippi, were just ministering to a group of women in Philippi that met down by the river. So for the high crime of just being faithful to God, ministering to people, and a love for the oppressed, specifically, they end up ministering to this demon-possessed girl, this slave girl, who Jesus had miraculously used Paul to set free from her torment. Because of those terrible crimes, we're told that the multitude rose up together against Paul and Silas. The magistrates or the leaders, they tore off their clothes. They're beaten with rods, Paul and Silas. They're then thrown into prison, and their feet are fastened in the stocks. Now, what's amazing about this story is that Luke tells us that when most men, and I think we can relate to this, would have sulked, at a minimum been really disappointed by this development. Vision in the night. They're ministering to people. You'd be bummed out, right? You'd be bummed, depressed, sulking. But not Paul and Silas. What's amazing about the story is that we're told that in the midnight hour, in the middle of the night, this bloodied and bruised Paul and Silas, who had been beaten and falsely accused, thrown into the stocks, we're told that in the middle of the night they were praying and singing hymns to God. What a scene, right? What faith, what tenacity. And while they're singing, while they're praying, without warning, we're told that a violent earthquake shook the prison. So that not only were the doors opened, but everyone's chains were loosed. Now, while all this is interesting in its own right, what happens next is totally unexpected. Now, if you were Paul or Silas, you would have seen the earthquake as being the evidence of God's deliverance. You're praying, you're singing, and God steps in and he's going to deliver you, give you escape from affliction. But that's not how Paul or Silas viewed the situation. You see, they end up resisting the natural urge to see suffering as being random, because Paul and Silas trusted that everything that they had experienced had been part of God's plan. And this shocking twist to the story, Paul and Silas, while the doors are open, their chains fall off, they don't leave. In fact, they willingly choose to remain in their cell to shelter in place. Now, though many of us would consider that decision to be somewhat ludicrous, I want you to think, why would Paul and Silas decide to remain in their affliction rather than seek escape? Why? Because as we unpack this, their reasons end up illustrating why this third driver of suffering, the suffering that happens in our lives independent of our involvement, is never random or without purpose, even a global pandemic. I want to read a little bit more of the story before we start to unpack these things. Acts 16, beginning with verse 27, we're told that the keeper of the prison, awaking from sleep, seeing that the prison doors were open, supposing that the prisoners had fled, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself. But Paul cried out with a loud voice. He said, "Do not harm yourself, for we're all here." So the keeper of the prison called for a light. Wasn't asking for a cigarette. He ran in and he fell down, trembling before Paul and Silas. And then he brings them out and he says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" What a question. So they said, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night and washed Paul and Silas' stripes. And immediately this prison guard and his family were baptized. Now when they had brought them into his house, he set food before them. He rejoiced, having believed in God with all of his household. First thing I want you to take note about this story is that God used their affliction to place Paul and Silas into the center of his will, God's will. Again, I've mentioned this before, but it's really apt with what we're facing. That even when things seem out of your control, never forget they're still under his authority. I mean, don't forget why Paul and Silas were in Philippi to begin with. Paul had received a vision of a man from Macedonia. And what makes that interesting is that according to Luke's record of their experiences so far in Philippi, we have zero mention of the Apostle Paul ministering to any men. You see, I'm convinced that following this earthquake, as Paul kind of surveyed the scene unfolding before him, which, by the way, included this jailer drawing his sword to kill himself, it hit Paul like a ton of bricks. The light bulb went off. He saw the greater purpose for what had happened, their imprisonment. God's plan came into view. You see, the man from Macedonia, they had been sent to help, was in actuality the Philippian jailer. Aside from the fact he's the first man mentioned that they minister to in Philippi, it seems very clear from his reaction to Paul's appeal that he do himself no harm, that something deeper was at work in his heart. I mean, the man's reaction was to ask, "What must I do to be saved?" Like, don't miss the implications for the mission to Philippi had been to reach this jailer the whole time, meaning the events of the last 12 or so hours take on a whole new level of purpose. Paul and Silas had been arrested, falsely accused, thrown into jail because God wanted them where? In jail, in close proximity to this man. God allowed their suffering to afford them a powerful way to demonstrate to the jailer the power of God, which then becomes all the more significant as God uses an earthquake to create a desperate moment in this man's life, perfect for the gospel message. We're going to continue this thought with more and more here on the Outlaw Radio Show. Don't go anywhere. I'm kind of in a flow. I'm just going to keep going. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, no. I don't have any questions so far. Anything that I want to talk about right now. So yeah, go
So
ahead.
we're just going to roll right into the second block, 12 minutes.
Roll on through.
3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Outlaw Radio Show. I'm talking about affliction, which we all understand. We're living in the midst of a global pandemic. Things have gotten bad. It's affected all of us to some degree. Others worse. But all of us in its generality. I'm looking at a story to try to provide you some hope. A story of Paul and Silas. Paul receives this vision of a man from Macedonia crying out for help. As a result, they set sail and they land in Philippi. They immediately begin meeting with Lydia and a group of women down by the river. Paul sets free this demoniac, this little slave girl, because this upset the power brokers. They end up getting arrested. False accusations are made. Paul and Silas are beaten. They're thrown into jail. They're placed in the stocks. And then what do? They praise God. They worship. And in the middle of the night, an earthquake shakes the jail, opens the doors, looses them of their chains. But instead of leaving, Paul and Silas choose to remain in their affliction. And we noted the first reason is because God used this terrible set of circumstances to place them in his perfect will. You see, the man from Macedonia was in actuality this Philippian jailer. And he draws the sword to kill himself, but because Paul and Silas chose to remain in their affliction, then flee. This man and his whole household get saved and baptized. It's an amazing story. You know, it's a tragic byproduct of living in a culture, an American culture, so consumed by luxury and comfort that, we tend to, if we're being honest, run from difficulty or at least discomfort. Like most of us, when we're faced with the prospects of something uneasy, like we will seek the quickest exit or the path of least resistance. And if you think you're immune from this tendency, next time you're in a tough spot, when a tough situation arises, just listen to your prayers. As a matter of fact, listen to your prayers right now in the midst of a pandemic. Woe is me. God, get me out of this. God, escape from this. Now, I'm not saying that these type of prayers are wrong. Case in point, Jesus, before the cross, he prayed 3 times, didn't he? If this is your will, may the cup pass from me. And yet, like Jesus, when it's all said and done, are you willing to resign yourself to the reality that there are instances where God's perfect will for your life includes suffering for a season? And in light of that, can you pray like Jesus? May this cup pass from me, but not my will, but your will be done. Like, imagine if Paul and Silas decided to escape as soon as the moment had presented itself. The jailer, not only would he have killed himself, but his soul would have been lost forever. You see, Paul and Silas, if they had fled, if they had looked for escape, they would have never afforded themselves the opportunity to see God's underlying purpose behind their affliction. My friend, instead of praying for escape, our prayer during COVID-19 should be for God to help us see the purpose behind our individual suffering. The second thing you learn from this story is that God used their affliction to accomplish his will. Like, don't miss this. Their suffering, which on the surface seems to be random and unfair, actually provided Paul and Silas the perfect opportunity and platform for ministry. The situation yielded by suffering and the godly witness of these men while suffering created the perfect conditions for them to minister to the jailer in the moment of his suffering. Doesn't the bridge between empathy and compassion require a measure of personal experience? Like, isn't it true the best comforters are those who have at some point been comforted? I mean, no one in the muck solicits advice from the person perched in the ivory tower. And because this is such a practical truth, we can trust that our present afflictions, even if they seem random and unfair, they do possess a future value and a redeeming purpose. Affliction yields within each of us, when it's all said and done, a greater capacity to minister to the afflicted. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 through 4, Paul writes, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in our tribulation." Why? That we may be able to comfort those who are in trouble with the same comfort with which we ourselves were comforted by God. Like, though I can concede the notion that God uses our afflictions, does little to alleviate one's present circumstances, never, ever, ever underestimate the profound significance, the ability to find meaning in the moment of pain will have on your ability to then endure and persevere through the pain you're experiencing. During the 19th and 20th centuries, as European societies grew more secular, key thinkers sought to define the driving force of human nature apart from the divine. Friedrich Nietzsche believed the, quote, will to power was the driving force behind human nature. Nietzsche taught that striving to reach one's highest position and potential in life through achievement was the key to satisfying the basic biological and psychological need. Sigmund Freud, another thinker, he disagreed, believing that, quote, the will to pleasure was instead the driving force behind human nature. Freud taught the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain was essential to satisfying this basic biological and psychological need. Soren Kierkegaard took an entirely different approach, seeing the, quote, will to meaning as the driving force behind human nature. Kierkegaard taught the importance of finding meaning in life as being the essential component to achieving biological, psychological satisfaction. Now, what's interesting about these three thinkers is that their theories were put to test in like the most brutal of ways during World War II, when millions of Jews were forced into the barbaric conditions of Nazi concentration camps. Now, as one might expect, when removed from the halls of academia and placed into the test tube of human suffering, the will to pleasure and the will to power proved to be an inadequate motivator for human survival. In his 1946 book, Man's Search for Meaning, neurologist and psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, he weighed in on this matter by chronicling his experiences as a prisoner at Auschwitz. For 4 years, Frankl was incarcerated at Auschwitz, and he discovered through his experiences, suffering we can't even imagine, that the only thing that aids a human being to endure human suffering was the quest to find meaning, purpose, in every experience. Based upon Kierkegaard's will to meaning thesis, logotherapy, or it came from his experiences, stated that meaning is the most powerful motivating force within humanity. Frankl observes that it was, quote, the way in which a man accepted his fate and all the suffering it entails, the way in which he takes up his cross, that gives him ample opportunity, even under the most difficult circumstances, to find deeper meaning in his life. In contrast, he also noted the greatest killer within a concentration camp was the singular acceptance that one's life no longer possessed any type of meaning. Frankl observed time and time again in Auschwitz that when a person had lost purpose in their suffering, they lost the will to live. Let me read you a section of his book. He says, the prisoner who had lost his faith in the future, his future was doomed. With his loss of belief in the future, he also lost his spiritual hold. He let himself decline and became subject to mental and physical decay. Usually this happened quite suddenly, in the form of a crisis, the symptoms of which were familiar to the experienced camp inmate. We all feared the moment, not for ourselves, which would have been pointless, but for our friends. Usually it began when the prisoners refusing one morning to get dressed, or they refused to wash or go out on the parade grounds. No entries, no blows, no threats had any effect on him. He just lay there, hardly moving. If this crisis was brought about by an illness, he refused to be taken to the sick bay or to do anything to help himself. He simply gave up. Like, though your suffering right now might seem to be random, it's not. Like Paul and Silas, please know it isn't. The notion that suffering is meaningless is a lie from hell. For if anyone believes that there is a sovereign God at work, they can trust there's a purpose behind all the activities he allows, including whatever affliction you're facing. Paul and Silas, they suffered greatly. But because they chose to stay in the difficult circumstance and hang around and minister to the Philippian jailer, they were able to see his whole family come to faith. I'm sure by the end of that dark night, they concluded the heavenly gains had outweighed their personal cost. Suffering had had a divine purpose. You know, when many of us jump at the first opportunity to get out from under our uncomfortable situations. What's tragic is we may be robbing ourselves of the very opportunity to see how God was planning to use those things to accomplish his purposes in and through our lives. What we don't realize is that while I may enjoy the immediate reprieve from whatever affliction was causing me pain, the long-term effects of suffering without ever being able to see the redeeming purpose, that may prove to be much more detrimental in the end. Like, consider, it was their decision to serve while suffering that enabled their healing from suffering. Like, did you notice in our text that following his conversion, the jailer does something incredible? Luke tells us that he takes Paul and Silas home, he feeds them, and he washes their wounds. Understand, the choice to remain in the pit and not escape and minister to the Philippian jailer proved to be the very way in which God practically tended to their own wounds. We're going to pick up that thought when we come back here on the Outlaw Radio Show. Before we wrap things up, I do want to say we want to hear from you, the listening audience, and there's several ways that you can reach out to us. First, email is the easiest, info@outlawradio.org. Additionally, we're on Facebook, facebook.com/The Radio Outlaw. And then we're also on Twitter. Our handle is @radio_outlaw. You can access all of this contact information as well as quick links to our podcast by visiting our website, which is outlawradio.org. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with the Outlaw Radio Show. What's up? What are you thinking?
Man. Currently, I'm, and this might be something that you're going to get to later. If it is, I apologize for stepping on your toes.
No, I'll just tell you that we'll move right on.
So we're talking about Paul and how he saw the reason for his suffering pretty quickly in the jailer and the jailer's family. And I was thinking about the contrast between that and Job, who, if I'm not much mistaken, I don't think ever really gets an answer for why.
No, he doesn't.
Like, Job never gets the answer. We all know the answer. And now what? 4,000 people, 4,000 years worth of people have been impacted by the story of Job, and it being a very good thing for us. But Job never got that answer. And so currently I'm thinking about the dichotomy between either getting the answer or not getting the answer, and which one I would prefer, and whether one is better than the other. And I'm not sure about either one. I'm not sure.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive because, okay, in Job's situation, his life falls apart. It all hits the fan.
Yeah, it gets real bad.
It gets real bad for Job, to the point that he finds himself sitting in an ash heap with like broken pieces of pottery, scraping at his boils. Like,
right.
He loses everything, everyone he loves. Like, it's bad. And his friends
are terrible.
Are just like, curse God and die. Like, basically where his life was.
His friends and his wife.
But he never curses God, and God comes to him and reveals himself in a profound way. And really, like, the grand story is that God, interestingly, the book of Job may very well be the first book of the Bible ever written.
Right, yeah.
The very first word of God to man is, you're going to suffer. That's the story, which is why it's so relatable. And yet, why Job never gets a why, the whole point of like 30 chapters is that God explains who. So it's like, okay, you need to understand, and the remedy to suffering is not necessarily an explanation why, but the explanation who's in control, who's allowing it, and that there's always a reason and a purpose. Now, we don't always get to see maybe the grand scheme of things, but there's never been a situation in my life, a period of suffering that I've had to endure, I've had to go through, that at least at some point in kind of a retrospective, hindsight being 2020, that I wasn't able to look back and say, I'm better for it. God worked that. I couldn't see it in the moment, but looking back, man, God used that, whether it's to equip me to help others or to reveal himself to me in a new way. Like, again, it's finding the importance, it's finding the person who provides the meaning, not necessarily the meaning.
I would agree with that, yeah.
And that it's
I'm on board with that.
And that it's Jesus. Like Paul and Silas, they could have run, they could have escaped when they had the moment. They chose to remain. And in doing so, they were able to minister to the jailer. And they were able to immediately see why they were there. God had a point. God had a purpose. Now, not every situation we face is the same, but like even right now, we're dealing with this pandemic. It's gnarly. It's dark. But there'll come a day that we'll be able to look back with a bit of 2020 and see the silver linings, to see how God used this in our own lives, societally, within church life. I'm going to continue this. Let me just we've got the second block. I'm in a groove.
Yeah, no.
And
Absolutely.
then I think we'll probably talk more about this at the end. So let's jump right back in. 11 minutes, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Outlaw Radio Show. We're talking about affliction. There was a study co-authored by Paul Arstein, PhD, Massachusetts General Hospital. And this study found that when chronic pain sufferers, which is what we're talking about affliction, we're talking about suffering, but when chronic pain sufferers spend their time serving others with the identical ailment, they reported feeling less personal discomfort. Like on a scale of 0 to 10, after 6 months of volunteering, people's average pain ratings dropped from a 6 to below a 4. It's not an accident. There's a correlation. Now, here's my point. If you've suffered or presently in the midst of an affliction like we all are, here's a remedy. Lending a hand to someone experiencing a similar pain, or just finding a simple way to serve someone else, not only provides your suffering a measure of purpose, God comforts us so we can comfort others, but it practically aids in your healing process. And that's what's interesting about that story with Paul and Silas. The earthquake frees them from their prison, but they remain. And as a result, the Philippian jailer comes to know the Lord, but then in turn, the Philippian jailer tends to their wounds and feeds them. They minister to someone, and in the process of ministering, they're ministered to in turn. You know, it's important we keep in mind a sobering reality. As is often the case when it comes to the nature of suffering, the events that unfolded that day in Philippi could have been used by Satan to discourage Paul and Silas. They could have been used by Satan to, at worst, destroy the life of the Philippian jailer. And yet, because they held Paul and Silas to that promise that God does work all things for the good, it's an anchor in the storm. Even our afflictions, not only was everyone blessed, but in the end, Jesus received glory in the process. Like Luke tells us that the end result of the entire evening was that the Philippian jailer rejoiced. He gives his life to the Lord. He rejoiced literally exceedingly, him and his whole family. Now, I have found that when a person comes to see that their present afflictions have a redeeming and lasting purpose, there tends to be no limit to their capacity for worship. Like, I can't wait for that Sunday when this pandemic is past, the shelter in place, quarantines have been lifted. I can't wait to hear the saints of God sing together that first Sunday back. Suffering does that. You know, lastly, looking at what we can take away from this story, you know, God used their affliction, the affliction of Paul and Silas there in Philippi, so that in turn they might reflect Jesus more powerfully in that society, in that culture. Let me just conclude the story. A few more verses in Acts 16. We're told that when it was day, so all of these things have happened, the magistrates sent the officers, and they said, let those men go. So they were deciding to let Paul and Silas leave. They had overreacted the day before. So the keeper of the prison reported these words to Paul, but Paul says, no, we're not going to go. They've beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans. They've thrown us into prison. Now they want to put us out secretly. No. Let them come themselves and get us out. So the officer returns, gives these words to the magistrates, and they freak out. Why? Because they heard that they were Romans who had been beaten and imprisoned without charge. So they came and they pleaded with them, brought them out, asked them to depart from the city. So when they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia, one of the women that they had been ministering to, when they had seen the brethren, this church has been born, They encouraged them. Paul and Silas encouraged them, and then they departed. Now, did you catch that? Even after the events of that night, Paul and Silas, they leave the home of the jailer. And where do they go? They go back to their prison cell. Like, Paul's concern and why he would do this is that while the magistrates would come to recognize that they were innocent of all charges, releasing them secretly when they had been accused openly wouldn't set the public record straight. And Paul cared about his reputation because his reputation reflected Jesus. You see, the only way to keep his name and therefore reputation from being tarnished, which would have really hindered the church, this new church. See, Paul demanded a public acquittal. That's why Paul not only stays in the jail, but then he plays his trump card by letting it slip that he and Silas had been beaten and thrown into prison as uncondemned Romans. Now, within the Roman Empire, most of the people's rights were trampled on. But a Roman citizen, man, their rights, that was no trivial matter. As citizens of Rome, Paul and Silas were guaranteed a trial with the right to appeal the verdict. But instead, they had been treated by the magistrates with contempt. And that, their beating alone, would have had major repercussions if Paul decided to push the issue. Which leads to like this really interesting thought. Like, why hadn't Paul played the Roman citizen card, before like being beaten or placed in the stocks? I'm convinced that knowing most of the people that he was reaching weren't Roman citizens and therefore didn't have that same card, that Paul more often than not willingly laid aside his Roman privilege, desiring to practically model how to handle suffering, how to handle affliction. Paul knew what would happen. Paul knew the result. One of the things that you come to admire about the Apostle Paul as you study his life is that Paul never preached a sermon he wasn't willing to live. Like, Paul rightly understood teaching the people what it looked like to rely on the grace of God when faced with suffering was one thing, but illustrating this life in a very practical way was entirely another. Like, the opportunity to suffer enabled Paul to reflect to the world around him a more powerful aspect of Jesus. That Jesus was also afflicted. Like, Jesus wasn't immune to pain. Jesus wasn't given a pass to the full human experience. Jesus willingly laid aside his heavenly citizenship in order to suffer and die. Not only to make way for our salvation, but Jesus did these things to earn the right to be relied on in the midst of our suffering. Friend, you know what makes Jesus such an incredible comforter? Is because he was comforted as well in his own affliction. He was afflicted. He suffered. God was not immune to the human condition. One of my favorite authors is a man by the name of Timothy Keller. And he wrote a little book called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. I encourage you, Amazon it. Buy the book. It will be a great encouragement with what we're all going through. But this is something he writes in this book, again, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, that really hit me. He writes, quote, Christianity teaches that contrary to fatalism, suffering is overwhelming. Contrary to Buddhism, suffering is real. Contrary to karma, suffering is often unfair. Contrary to secularism, suffering is meaningful. You see, Christianity teaches that there's a purpose to suffering. And if faced rightly, it can drive us like a nail deep into the love of God and into more stability and spiritual power than you could ever imagine. Let me ask you real quick, this corona pandemic, COVID-19, is this crisis driving you like a nail deeper into the love of God? Is this crisis placing you not on shifting sand, but on the more stability of the rock that doesn't move? Are you growing stronger or weaker through this crisis? Friend, if the life of Jesus teaches us anything, it's that while suffering may be an inescapable part of what it means to be human, God can use our suffering, your suffering. He can use it in incredible ways. Suffering can place us in the center of God's will. I was talking with Creighton after our live stream service this past Sunday. I asked Creighton, I said, hey, how was the service? You know, it's so hard to tell. You're looking into a camera. People are looking onto a screen. You can't see. There's this great disconnect. As a pastor, you can tell if the message is resonating when you're teaching to a live audience. Very difficult with a live stream. So I asked Creighton, I said, Creighton, how was the service? And he says, I really think, that God is really going to be able to take a real disconcerting situation, and he's going to use it for good things. And I thought about it, and I turned to Creighton, and I said, like, what if this is the perfect condition? Like, what if we're not making the most of a bad situation, but we're making the most of the most perfect situation that God would have for us? Again, do you believe that you're in the center of God's will? Do you believe that your circumstances are out of his control? Do you believe that his sovereignty has somehow taken a back seat? Do you believe that God is in heaven freaking out that someone made a mistake? I don't. I believe right now we're all exactly where he wants us to be. I'm going to wrap this up, and then we'll talk. 3, 2, welcome back to the Outlaw Radio Show. This story of Paul and Silas making their way from Troas to Philippi after Paul receives this vision of a man from Macedonia pleading, come and help me. They get to Philippi and they start ministering as Paul always did. Amazingly, for the high crimes of serving God and being faithful, caring for people. They get arrested, falsely accused, slandered. They get beaten brutally, imprisoned unfairly, unjustly. They get shackled like the worst of the worst, thrown into the dungeon. And yet Paul and Silas, they rejoice. And in the midnight hour, as they're singing hymns to the Lord, there's an earthquake that not only opens the prison doors, but it frees them from these shackles. They could leave. They could run out. They were liberated. But Paul and Silas do something interesting. They sheltered in place. They stayed where they were. God had led them to this point, and they believed that there was a purpose behind it that they weren't going to circumvent by just running. The Philippian jailer, charged with their care, worried that with prisoners escaping, his life would be ruined. He draws a sword and he goes to kill himself. And Paul cries out, "We're all here." Guy comes and falls at his feet. "What must I do to be saved?" Believe on Jesus, Paul says. And this man and his whole household give their lives to the Lord, and they're baptized that night. And then the jailer feeds Paul, cleans their wounds. And then Paul and Silas go right back to the prison. They believe that God was using their affliction, using their suffering to accomplish much bigger aims. Do you believe the same thing? You see, suffering, affliction can place us, and it does, into the center of God's will. Look no farther than Jesus. The cross was in the center of God's will. You see, suffering, it can provide us unimaginable opportunities for ministry, and in turn can aid us in our own healing process. See, when it's all said and done, the way we handle suffering in a fallen world with no answer, it reflects Jesus. It demonstrates Jesus. Never, ever forget, the glories of an empty tomb could never have existed if not for the afflictions of a bloody cross. Going back to the story I used in our intro, Chad Arnold was going to die. Liver failure. Wouldn't see his 39th birthday without a transplant. And his brother stepped in. Ryan willingly went under the knife to save the life of his brother. And then some 4 days later, he was dead. Chad was alive, but Ryan was dead, and it was a blow to the family. But if all this hadn't been enough, the story doesn't end there. Their father still had to break the news to Chad, who was in recovery, unaware of what had happened to his brother. Like, I mean, if you're that dad, what do you say? How do you break that kind of news? The blog post, it records that the father entered, woke Chad, and then ever so gently said to him, "Chad, Ryan, your brother, is dead, but we still serve a good God." Now understand, while Chad, knowing his father was right, did his best to maintain a godly perspective, it was only natural that he was haunted by the guilt, that he struggled for purpose behind Ryan's death. Like, can you imagine the knowledge your life was made possible because of your brother's death? That his wife and his kids had lost a loved one? I mean, that's a weighty, weighty thing, isn't it? Chad, he recounts the struggles of this experience, and he said it wasn't until a visiting coworker came to visit who explained to him that his godly example through this tragedy had actually caused him to reassess his own life. And it was in that moment that Chad came to this realization that as tragic as it was, his suffering, and as painful as it was, God could use his experience to help others. You see, while it would always be difficult, Chad understood the tragedy of his brother's death could be turned into something redemptive, that God had a purpose, that God had a plan. After coming to terms with this truth, Chad actually writes in his journal one verse, 1 John 3:16. He says, "This is how we know what love is, that Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers." Exactly what Ryan had done. I say if you're afflicted, we all are. We're all going through something massive. Today I called my 90-year-old grandfather. It's his birthday. And I was talking to Big O and asking him about this situation, and he said, "Zach, I've never seen anything like this in my life. I've never seen anything like this. I've never experienced what the world is experiencing and the uncertainty it's fostering." If you're afflicted, and we all are, I want you to know first, we're not being punished by God. We're not. There might be others who are, but the righteous aren't. What does God have to judge? Our sin's been judged already on the cross of Calvary. We're not being punished. As a matter of fact, what we can say is that our suffering is actually God's way of placing us in the center of his will. That the church, that Christians, that believers, we have an incredible opportunity to minister to a world asking questions it would rather avoid. Life, mortality. It's at the forefront. Friend, nothing ever happens in your life without first being filtered through God's love, through God's plan for you, which means your suffering isn't random, your affliction is not without meaning, it's not without a point. God will use these things to not only provide you greater opportunities to minister, but God will use this situation to help you identify with and reflect a suffering Savior in a suffering world. Never forget, the brighter a light shines, the more heat the lamp has to endure. In closing, I just want to share a few stanzas of one of my favorite hymns. O heart bereaved and lonely, whose brightest dreams have fled, whose hopes like summer roses are withered, crushed, and dead. Though link by link be broken, and tears unseen may fall, look up amid thy sorrow to him who knows it all. Oh, cling to thy Redeemer, thy Savior, brother, friend. Believe and trust his promise to keep you till the end. Oh, watch and wait with patience, and question all you will. His arms of love and mercy are round about thee still. Look up, the clouds are breaking. The storm will soon be over, and thou shalt reach the haven where sorrows be no more. Look up, be not discouraged. Trust on whatever fall. Remember, oh remember, thy Savior knows it all. Well, you've been listening to the Outlaw Radio Show. If you like what you heard, I want to encourage you to do two things. First, contact your local Christian radio station and just thank them that they exist, that they're sowing seeds of the gospel into your community through that local dial. Also, thank them that they're carrying Outlaw Radio in your community. We're so thankful for our radio partners. Second thing I want to encourage you to do is to visit our website, outlawradio.org. From the site, you can access our podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasting as well as Google Play. You can listen again to this episode in its entirety, all previous episodes, and then you can share them to your entire social network. Finally, we want to connect. Twitter at @radio_outlaw. Send me an email, info@outlawradio.org, or you can follow us via facebook.com/theradioOutlaw. Once again, I'm Zach Adams, and I hope you join me again this time next week for more of the Outlaw Radio Show.
It's a really good hymn.
That's a great hymn. As I'm reading it, I can hear Andy singing it.
Yeah, me too.
Oh, heart bereaved and lonely.
It's a great hymn.
You know, the very first time we actually did that hymn was with this Bible study.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, we did this, like the original Bible study was when we were going verse by verse through Acts, obviously.
Right.
I ended up pulling that out. I created a topical message, very close to what this is, that I taught. Last I taught it was in 2016, in the summer of 2016. When everyone's at church.
Man, that was a long time ago also, which is crazy.
It was during that time period that Andy introduced that hymn, and it still resonates. Written so many years ago. What do you think of the whole idea? I think it's a timely message. I think it was important for us to do this. I hope you find this episode to be an encouragement.
I do, so I hope they do too. It was once again we've had another Outlaw Radio that is uplifting, which is nice because of how dark everything else that I listen to on a regular basis is. This is one of the few uplifting things in terms of media that I've been a part of in, I don't know, at least all day, maybe the last few days. That's not like coronavirus sad, election sad, like
we're all gonna die sad.
Yeah, exactly.
I was talking to my grandmother. So I talked to Big O, wished him a happy birthday today. 90 years old.
Hot dang.
Old as dirt.
Yep.
Big O. But I was talking to my grandmother, who hasn't been in the best of health. Neither of them have. They're very, very susceptible to this thing. And if either of them were to contract it, I would fear the worst, honestly. A bad flu, I would fear the worst.
Understandably so.
But I was talking to my grandmother and just trying to provide her words of encouragement. And I told her, I said, Grandma, I mean, in the end, what's the worst that could happen? And she says, I finally get to see Jesus. Like that's literally the worst that can happen, as you get to see Jesus.
Yeah.
And even if you don't get to see Jesus physically, you still get to see Jesus. Even if it doesn't take your life, no matter what it looks like, how this crisis manifests, if you let it, you'll still see Jesus. I'm so encouraged that we serve a God who has suffered. It's one of the unique things of Christianity. The God who has suffered.
Yeah.
He's
Buddha, not on a high horse above.
Right.
separated from us in intangible ways. In
There's
some
a-
ways he is, but he's not in the form of suffering.
My favorite line is that no one in the muck wants advice from someone in an ivory tower.
Yes, I liked that a lot.
And I'm just glad that Jesus has been in the muck.
Yeah.
Like he's been in the muck. And he knows exactly how to comfort. Like in Hebrews where we told we have a high priest who can sympathize with our
Right.
weakness. Literally it resonates.
What's the verse where it says that he's been tempted and tried in all the ways common to man? Something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea is that Jesus, we talk about the humanity of Jesus, but we also need to add within the humanity of Jesus that Jesus didn't okay, I'll be a man, but here's a few experiences that
I'm just not going to do.
I'm gonna avoid. No, he was like, I'm doing this, so I'm gonna do. It's kind of like I think of what's the guy's name? The Dirty Jobs guy.
Mike Rowe.
Mike Rowe. I love the fact that Mike Rowe's yeah, I'm going to do a show called Dirty Jobs. And then I'm going to not only document these terrible professions, but I'm going to literally do the job of these guys in illustrating their job.
Yes.
And you see him just engage in some of the vilest.
Oh, just the worst things that a person has to do to keep our society running.
I think of Jesus in that sense. This is the human experience. I'm not going to just learn about it by reading about it or watching others. I'm going to come and live it, and I'm going to experience it, and I'm going to be a part of it. So, you have anything else you want to add?
I don't think so. I thought you did a very comprehensive job there.
That was
well
good.
done.
Well, I was this past Sunday at Calvary 316. I was kind of between, do I want to do the study on storms or this one?
Mm-hmm.
And I decided to go with the storms. And ended up completely rewriting the entire Bible study. I thought, yay, I'm going to be able to kind of work this out, take an oldie but goodie and kind of revamp it, and ended up man, this could be such a better Bible study. And it took me 2 days later. I'm Jess was I thought you were going to have an easier week. And I was yeah, that's what I thought too. But the Lord had a different plan. And then I thought it would be great to kind of do this here with the Outlaw Radio Show so that the Calvary 316 peeps aren't getting repeated material, but you're getting new stuff.
Absolutely.
Where you're at. And so I hope you're blessed. We love you guys. If you're in need, you need help in any way, we're all suffering together. Some of us less than others, but we're all in it together. The brighter a light shines, the more heat the lamp has to endure. Don't forget it. God bless. We love you guys. Thank you for being with me, Creighton.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Always a pleasure.
All right. God bless. Talk to you soon. All right. Kill the cameras.